Hello, so today I'm delighted to be talking to Perpetua and Rebecca, academics from the University of Sussex, who are researching education in an uncertain world. And I was actually fortunate to see them both in action at a recent training day for teachers over in Wales. How are you both?
Good, thanks.
We,
Yeah, great. Thanks for having us along.
yeah, fine. Thank you, Paul. And it was so lovely to see you in Wales.
So we've come up with some questions just to structure our conversation. And the first one is, what is practical philosophy?
Okay, Paul. Well, I'm going to have a go at answering that one for you. So, we really think about it as how we work out how to live together in the world. And there's no right answer about how best to live together, and it does need some working out. It's challenging and it's always uncertain as to what emerges as we do this working out. But it does allow for us to produce some new ways of thinking and doing things. So practical philosophy, we think, is very much embedded in ideas of democracy. It emphasizes the importance of taking seriously different perspectives and points of view. And it requires each of us to come to a considered position in order that we can take some action, ideally, to make things better in the world. And democracy asks us all that we work things out together for the benefit of the individual and the collective.
So traditionally, people have got quite narrowed ideas of sort of education around sustainability and climate change, and they might often think to the science of sort of climate and sustainability. But why is it then ideas like this are important for sustainable or sustainability education?
Well, I think firstly, science is really important, obviously, in relation to sustainability education, and those core curricular focus is key. We need children and students to know about sustainability issues in the breadth and sort of curricular knowledge. So it's not saying that this is something that replaces that. So what we're suggesting is that practical philosophy is important because sustainability is more than just a scientific or a technical issue, and it needs more than just money or science to throw at it. We know that people are worried about climate change and biodiversity loss, and that's adults, but also children and young people, including young children. And I suppose, living with climate change and knowing the sort of mass extinction of other species, it requires something of us. We've all got to make difficult daily decisions about what we might do about those decisions and, about those challenges. And there's rarely one right answer. It's going to vary for each of us depending on where we are, our particular circumstances, the place, the time. So these are things we've got to work out in the everyday of our lives. And what practical philosophy allows us all to do, young people and educators, is to have a space to really engage with those difficult dilemmas and those uncertainties about what we might do in the world, so that we can think through what more we might need to know, including from our teachers or elsewhere, but also what each of us think, what we feel, and what we might imagine about what might be possible to do differently. And then all of that discussion is going to be rooted in what we value and what we bring in terms of our different values, as well as what we know. So it's not just the curriculum, it extends beyond that. And thinking this through can really help us to work out what it is we feel we need to do, whether, again, individually, as Rebecca's saying, or collectively, whether that's a class or a whole school community, or even in the wider community, either in terms of our own lives when we leave the school gates, because much of our lives is beyond the school gates, or with community organisations, for example.
So what are some of the challenges then in terms of schools exploring this and engaging with it?
Probably the most difficult thing is it's difficult to do for students and teachers. So it's difficult to stay with difficulty. It's demanding emotionally. We might feel sort of uneasy about it or not able to do it, and it's quite easy to want to avoid doing it, but it's also demanding intellectually. But at the same time, we suggest that anyone can do it. We've used this approach with very young children, school pupils, and our own university students. And it's difficult, as I said, because we've got to stay with that dilemma, that issue that isn't hasn't got a clear, easy answer. It's not just like working out algebra or, another mathematical sum where we know we're going to come to a fixed answer that the teacher can tell us we're right about. It's actually one where even the teacher can't really know they can't know what each of us must do about these dilemmas. What to buy in the shop, for example, which bananas to buy, or organic or not organic, and all the multiple variabilities or a decision where price is obviously a factor for lots of people. These are really difficult dilemmas, and they're tricky. So that's difficult, just staying with that. And then there's a really key question that we ask in practical philosophy, which is whether what we think we desire in life is in fact desirable. Is it desirable for ourselves, for others, including others living, say, in the global south who have a greater risk of climate extreme, or those living in poverty, even in the global north? Or is it desirable for other species and the planet as a whole? So that's a really challenging question for us all. Is what I desire indeed desirable, given the climate change and the other challenges? But it's arguably a sort of key purpose of a key purpose of education, that question, particularly given the challenges that we're facing. And I think the last thing that's difficult is for us as teachers to not know the right answer in advance. We're used to going into a classroom, getting our students to come to the answer, and we know it, and we ensure we know it before they do, so that we can teach it. So then to ask teachers to go into a space which is more uncertain, it can be it can sort of be difficult and uncomfortable for us as teachers. But the teacher's role in a practical philosophy is really key. They've got to really model, and to model staying with that difficulty, and they've got to require students to do three things, I think. The first is they've got to ensure that students give deep attention to an issue that's being studied, and to stay with it even when it's uncomfortable or it's difficult because there isn't a clear answer. The second is that they've got to know that it's okay not to know the answer where there isn't an obvious one. And therefore to avoid coming too quickly to an answer that is unsatisfactory but sort of easy to get to, which leads to, again, an unsatisfactory decision about what to do, without first really considering a range of perspectives and examining different competing sources of information, for example. And lastly, the third is that they check and verify that we can support any decisions we come to with known facts or experiences. So we want our students to come to a position so that they can take action, but one that's really verified.
What really excites me about this is that sense of kind of co-creation, that there's a process involving both the teacher and learner in a more collaborative sense. But also that this is a journey or a process. It's not about an end goal. Yes, there is a kind of an end goal, but what's really important is the process of how that's then achieved and the sort of journey. So what then are some examples of practical philosophy?
Well, thanks, Paul. Well, an example that many people might be familiar with is that of philosophy for children, or it's often known too as a community of inquiry approach. But there are other examples, including discussing something we might call a wicked problem, such as one that we recently encountered actually with a primary school who have been very enthusiastically setting about growing their own vegetables with a view to thinking that these could be incorporated into the midday meal that's shared, only to discover that due to all sorts of rules and regulations with the catering company that this wasn't straightforward, and indeed at that particular time wasn't possible. So that was going to take some unraveling. So but other things we might think about are things that challenge the presumption of our like human dominance over other species and the extraction of natural resources for human gain. So a practical philosophical activity requires students to pay deep attention, certainly to things that aren't human, to non-human species. This is so that they might think about what it is, for example, that these non-human things might teach us about how to live together. So we might encourage students, in order to do this, to spend time in silent moments, for example, sort of doing things that are often perhaps a bit frowned upon in our fast-paced curricula, sort of gazing, listening, observing the natural world. Sometimes we ask them to respond to doing this using creative methods, drawing, crafting, writing, or even choreographing sequences of movements, to sort of think about new wicked problems or uncertainties that might emerge for them in order to take these further.
I've heard this explained in one way, that the role of a teacher is often to curate the daydreaming of children. And I think that often, you don't want your children to daydream. That if they're looking out the window, they're doing the wrong thing. And this instead is shifting that focus and saying, no, actually, those are moments that are really important, and we need to emphasize those and draw on those.
What a wonderful expression. I've not come across that, Paul, but I think we might use that, Perpetua.
Yeah, that's great.
The other one I was going to say is the philosophy for children is something that's really ingrained in the first school that we worked with very closely, Minchinhampton, and we've seen some amazing examples of that, where the conducting a classroom like that is very normalized, and the students feel very comfortable in that setting, because it does take a slight shift, doesn't it? It's not the easiest thing just to step into. It's a different dynamic, but once that's set up and established, the quality of the sort of responses and opinions and response also in terms of respect across the classroom, we've seen that to be really valuable.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that we've seen with that, Paul, too, is that this isn't about, although we've said it's demanding intellectually, anyone can do it. It starts with the presumption of all our equality to do this, and we enter into that space in any way that we can. And that is the wonderful thing, I think, about philosophy for children and that approach. So it's very, very inclusive too.
So I think you hit on something there that's really important, is the shift and making that shift. And that is something, it is about how do we signal to students that we're shifting from a sort of an approach where we're just telling them things and they need to get it, to a space where we're opening it up. And sometimes we've actually signaled that shift with images to let students know, especially younger students, we're now operating in a different mode, which is more democratic.
I remember this from the training day, actually. There's 3 learning, they're not learning styles, are they? It's learning, how would you describe it?
We call them models or heuristic. We use the plane, the train, and the boat. The plane is where we sit down and just listen to the teacher. We all sit forward, facing in rows, which is most of our teaching, isn't it, Rebecca? Most of, even in higher education, most of it we're lecturing or whatever, a lot of it, not necessarily most of it. And then there's the train, which is the discovery progressive model, where we get people to experiment and, do things, but ultimately they're still coming to the correct answer. And then we're talking about being in the boat, which is where we sort of set sail and we don't know what we're going to discover. It's a sort of exploration. So it's stepping into the boat. In the P4C, philosophy for children, we sit in the boat together. The teacher's in the boat, the students are in the boat, and we know we're exploring things, but none of us really know what we're going to find.
But we're all holding on to one another, supporting each other, so that we don't fall out.
Yeah. I do think those 3 symbols, those 3 icons, are really helpful in visualizing and categorizing that. So I think that when I was there on that day, that really was an effective thing. But how might educators use practical philosophy in their sort of week or month, or how might they integrate this?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Well, we think that actually a practical philosophical approach can be as short or as long as you're able to make it, or indeed as you want it to be. So it can be very much integrated into perhaps an existing planned lesson, briefly, by pausing to ask students, oh, well, what does this sustainability related issue or topic that we're focused on in this moment, what does it require of each of us? And they might listen to different perspectives and be asked to take these into account before they come to their own position. And that might be done, quite speedily. But if it is possible to slow the pace of a lesson, rather than perhaps just sitting at the table, it might be possible to go outside, to spend time with, other non-human beings, to notice change over the course of the term or the year, and allowing for the ordinary of our immediate environments to become extraordinary. So I mean, it could be through examining the weeds in the playground, but also thinking about the sort of mycelial threads that connect old trees in the grounds, this particular soundscape, the sound of the rain, the animals, or even particular human-made technologies. And so there are endless possibilities but also engaging with literature and the arts would expand what might be noticed and considered and acted upon. I mean, these are all activities actually that we do with even our master's level students at university, but also we do in nurseries too, with very young children.
Thinking about those models that we were talking about, Paul, we've actually recently designed an online education resource that's free to download. And it includes details of those 3 models, the plane, the train, and the boat, but also many examples of activities and some short films that go with it that highlight the sorts of things Rebecca's talking about. They're really sort of, detailed examples. And they're organised around a number of themes such as water, apples, forests, wind, etc. So that would be great if you
yeah, we can definitely share that. Has it got a name? Is that?
Yeah, it's called Creating with Uncertainty, an educational resource for a changing world. I think it's the subtitle.
Yeah, no, that's a great document, and that's actually one that we're going to try and work a bit closer with you as well to think how we can better integrate that across all of the big questions and things that we've got. But thank you so much for sharing your experience. I mean, was there anything else you wanted to add or have thought of?
Just a thank you, really, Paul. I mean, one of the things we talk a lot about is symbiosis. And, the importance of really us all connecting together, everyone who's trying to think about these, it's challenging, and to share ideas, share experiences, and sort of work with each other to really try and tackle the challenges that we've all got.
For me, it feels like this is a path kind of we've not walked this path before. This is, and I guess it goes back to the core of uncertainty, really, isn't it? There's not a roadmap to how this is done. We can't say, that there was something in the past that was similar. This very much is, it's a rubbish word to use, unprecedented. But in that sense, there's uncertainty.
Yeah,
there is. I mean, funnily enough, one of the things that's enduring is the challenges of relationships. Just everyday relationships are one of the most challenging things to negotiate. They're highly uncertain. How to respond in any given moment, whether it's a parent with a teenage daughter, or who's refusing to do something, or someone else, or a romantic relationship. So we know that we engage with uncertainty all the time in our everyday relationships, and it's really maybe about translating that into the bigger picture. In fact, how are we going to engage with the relationship with other people around the world, but also other beings that live on the world? We need to extend our framework of relationships and how we cultivate more positive relationships globally.
There's maybe one more thing. I know this is probably a bit indulgent, but one thing that I would really like to talk to you a little bit more about, as well as that sense of the non-human, because I think that's also something that's so special in this, is actually in teaching. People are very ignorant to these things. I think that the reality is we're very human-centered, and if it doesn't involve people, it's not necessarily important. Even when we're exploring biology or the sciences, it's from a human perspective. And I just wonder, what's your sense of that?
Yeah, actually, that's really interesting, Paul. We've been thinking, for example, actually just earlier this week, we were thinking actually about a relationship of an adult with a very young child, a child of just 2, in a park, a relationship. This child was very drawn to the idea of moving a slug that they were worried about a dog might come and sort of pick up and eat. And this young child was engaged with this adult, and that was putting it in a bucket and moving it somewhere else. And well, one of the questions that it drew our attention to was, well, in this context, so this is obviously a relationship between the adult and this very young child, but it's also about a relationship with the dog, the slug, the bucket, the sort of verdant sort of greenery that the slug was chomping through. And it raised the question for us, well, actually, who is the teacher in that context for this child? We assume, of course, it's that symbiosis between the adult and the child, but maybe it's the slug. Well, you know, and I think this is exciting and it makes us feel uncomfortable too as human adults, particularly if we're teachers, about thinking perhaps the non-human can be the teacher. And, you know, what are the sort of uncertain, creative, generative questions that raises for us?
One last point on that, because I was teaching this to master students yesterday, is that actually recent technologies have revealed that the human is far more non-human than human. So in terms of our DNA, we have more DNA that is not human in us than human because of our biomes, our microbiomes, primarily the gut, but also on our skin and everything. So they were quite sort of, you could see them just thinking, you know, wow, I'm not actually as human as I thought I am. And it's because of our symbiotic relationship with our gut that we've been able to survive over, you know, millennia. So it sort of starting to understand that we're not as, you know, human-centered as we even think we've led ourselves to believe. It's only because of that, the non-human relationships, that we can survive. And rather than seeing that as simply extractive, we embody really that symbiotic sort of imperative, really.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation. And we really look forward to kind of following more of your research, and we'll definitely make sure we share the uncertainty document and the booklet with all teachers. So thank you.
Thank you, Paul. It's great. Thanks for your support as well. It's really lovely to talk to you today.
Thanks so much.